afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everybody who's joined online. It's really my pleasure to welcome Professor Christo Venter. I will talk a little bit about his background, but I'll also kind of just let him introduce some more about himself, what he's been doing. But he is our lead author on one of the papers we're working on for the World Resources Report. This is a paper with this title, Equitable Access to Opportunities. He's a professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He's a well-recognized expert on working on this issue of accessibility in cities and how do you ensure equitable access, how do you analyze accessibility, measure it, which is a subject of, some debate. The whole transportation profession has, over the last few years, moved towards this understanding of, accessibility as being the key metric we need to focus on as opposed to mobility, not so much on mobility. So there's some debate around the ways you measure it in the field, and I think we're addressing some of those issues in the paper. But you will also hear from Christo about how you could kind of use new data, new analytical techniques to measure accessibility in the global south, where often you have data poor environments. So with that, hi Anya. With that, what I will do here is go over a little bit of the background of the WRR framing very, very briefly. I think many people in the room would have, if you've seen presentations we've done in the WRR papers, you're probably familiar with it. It's good to have a reminder. I'll do it really quickly, and then I'll hand it over to Christo to go over the content of the paper, the analysis, the solutions that we're suggesting in the paper, and so on. This is really the framing that 2 years ago we published in the WRR framing paper. This is the WRR on sustainable cities, I should clarify. Really the point that this chart makes is, we typically understand sustainable cities to be composed of these three spheres, if you will, three issues of environment, equity, and the economy. And what we're saying in the WRR is, if you think about the way people experience a city, it is through certain core services that they encounter in the city. So whether it is housing, whether it is transportation, water, sanitation, energy, if you thought of equitable access to these core services as being your entry point towards making lives better for these people, for the larger majority of people, the underserved, in the global south, you could achieve a more economically productive city and a city with a higher environmental quality. And that's because, again, people experience the city through these core services as they go about being economically productive, in their jobs, and as they go about consuming, which has environmental consequences. So this is kind of the framing that we've tried to carry through in sectoral papers we're working on each of these topics. And Christo here is going to be talking about the transportation paper in particular. We have already launched the paper on housing and the paper on energy. The others are in progress. So the premise, as I mentioned, is, the whole project, we're calling it Towards a More Equal City. And the premise is equitable access to core services leads to a more economically productive and an environmentally sustainable city for everybody. The focus of this report is really on identifying those high priority solutions in each of these sectoral areas for an audience we term as urban change agents. So it's not just directed at city decision makers, but all the stakeholders within the city, the civil society organizations, the private sector, government agencies at various levels that have a stake and have a say in how cities implement actions. The research papers are on all solutions, as well as there's a parallel effort where we're looking at a more cross-sectoral approach across cities. So we're doing case studies of 8 cities in the global south as well. So that's just a broad picture of the whole WRR effort. I won't go too much into this, but to be able to come up, as you can imagine, with these solutions in the papers, we wanted to be able to appropriately nuance them for different types of cities. And so we came up with a categorization of cities that's essentially based on where they are today in their income and the pace at how their urban population growth is expected to keep pace with their urban economic growth. And we have this categorization of struggling, emerging, thriving, and stabilizing cities. This is the analytics behind it, but it's probably better to see it on a map here. And what you see is that really the struggling and emerging cities that we came up with, and this is primarily an economic and demographic categorization. It's based on those types of indicators. The struggling and emerging cities are primarily Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. And so it's the focus of the WRR solutions is actually ending up being these areas. There's a lot of good practices to learn from cases that have, countries that have urbanized earlier, that have good examples to follow from Latin America and elsewhere. But essentially, this is where our focus is. And again, focusing on contexts that have very low budgets per capita, where the need for core services is going to outpace economic growth, possibly. We're also talking about urgent solutions that city leaders need to implement today, but also those that have potential for lock-in effects. So things like land and transportation, energy, very important here. But I will kind of end it there with this question that was our lead-in to the transportation paper. That now that you've kind of heard about the framing of the WRR, the approach in this paper is, this is the research question. How can cities in the global south manage urban transport such that they improve equitable access to opportunities for the urban underserved while bringing economic and environmental benefits to the whole city? And with that, I'll hand it to Christo.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Anjali. I'm not going to add anything more about myself, but I do want to say that it's been a fun project working on this together with you and other folks at WRI, and I'm glad to be here. I've kind of recovered from jet lag, but it might not last the whole seminar, so we'll see how far we get. What's been fun about this is it's been good to see a convergence between the kinds of thinking that I and other people have been doing around accessibility and the thinking that you guys are doing here about how to make it practical and how to use it, well, how to move towards using it more as a practical kind of planning and evaluation tool. So it's been also an interesting opportunity for me to ask myself the question, what new is there that we should be focusing on as we look at mobility challenges or transport challenges through the lens of equity in cities. And as I got the chance to dig into the literature again and kind of review some of the things that that we've been talking about and writing about for a long time, I realized that a lot of the things that I will talk about today and things that are included in the paper are things that we kind of know how to do already. So we know how to, what better streets should look like, and we know how to, what's needed in terms of managing car demand and how to run good public transport systems and so on. But I think what seems to be missing is a sense of prioritization of where to start and how different cities in different places or different kinds of challenges should pick certain of these things to start doing and doing them in the right order and in the right scale. So I hope that's one of the things that we sort of address in the paper. And I think the second thing is that we also should learn from places where things haven't quite worked and where, even though we know what to do, they are not being implemented. So we've also asked the question of what are those sort of success factors and those enablers that actually allow us to start moving in the right direction in places where they haven't happened. So I think that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. So I'm going to take you through the thinking, the analytical thinking behind the measurement and the mapping that we've done, which might be sort of of interest to a lot of you that are more on the research side, and then to take you through the action areas and the specific priority actions that we've identified in the paper. So the first is again just to say that we're looking at the question of equitable transport through this lens of accessibility. So accessibility to opportunities really being that good that we are trying to deliver with our transport system. And and we measure equity in relation to access to opportunities that gives us the good things that we want in the end: livelihoods, the social inclusion, access to social services, and quality of life, and so forth. So we define accessibility then as the ability to reach desired opportunities from a specific location in the city. And we do not discard the idea of mobility. Of course, we measure that as, we think of that as the extent to which people are actually able to make use of the accessibility that they have. Or in some cases, the extent to which people are not able to make use of the accessibility that they have. And we can measure that by taking a look at people's actual travel patterns, their travel times and their travel costs, and one can even look at travel frequencies and activity participation, even though we haven't done that. And we measure travel cost in terms of both time and money, because both are aspects of the amount of resources that we invest in transport. We developed the analytical thinking and applied it to 2 case study cities that we selected for the purposes of this paper. The one is Johannesburg, which is the biggest metropolitan area in South Africa, and about 5 million people or so. And then Mexico City, which was mostly contributed by the WRI partners here. And we firstly looked at accessibility to jobs. We only looked at jobs because that's the data that's available, but that's not the only type of access, of course, that's relevant, but that's what we've measured here. For all residents in the city from different locations of each city. And we measured the access in terms of the number of jobs that people can reach within 60 minutes travel time. So a pretty basic access indicator. The question is reachable how? So we did disaggregate it by mode, and the mode that people actually use from the location where they live. Mode disaggregated into 3 groups: the car mode, which we estimated using actual congested speeds for the road network, so taking congestion into account. We looked at transit access, and here we made a point of including the informal public transport routes and networks as well. So in the case of Johannesburg, that's minibus taxis, which carry about 60% of public transport trips. And in the case of Mexico City, it was the microbuses, which carry similar numbers of people. And then lastly, also the walk mode. So we want to look at people who use only walking as their main mode. And anything else, smaller percentages of bike users and so on, we didn't include in this round of the analysis. So what did this give us? The first thing it gave us was a graph, which I'm now convinced is too complicated, but I'm sure you will be able to figure this out, where we plotted the cumulative distribution of the percentage of residents in each city with a given access to jobs in that city. So if you look, for instance, at the top graph here, we have plotted Johannesburg, and you can see, for instance, that there's a small percentage of maybe 15% or so of people who have access to very few jobs, and those are primarily walkers, people who currently only walk to their jobs, and then the graphs turn upwards slightly. So in the case of so one can sort of see a kink here at 80%. So in the case of Johannesburg, you can see that about 80% of the population has access to about 60% of the jobs. In the case of Mexico City, 80% of the population has access to only about 25% of the jobs. So there's a big sort of inequity or inequitable distribution of accessibility across the population. At the upper end then here, there's, in the case of Mexico City, about 20% of people in both of these cases which have access to a lot more jobs. And that gives us a sense of how the equity distribution, what the equity distribution looks like in each of these cities. The data for Mexico City is preliminary, so we if one looks at the modal distribution here, it looks a little bit counterintuitive, where we've plotted the color of the dot here to represent the mode that people actually use, and you can see that private vehicle users, according to our analyses, have lower accessibility than a lot of the transit users. And there's something about that we still need to be checking, so I think that some of these graphs will still change, but I think the basic message is likely to be the same. If we look at the average accessibility in each city, in the case of Johannesburg, the first red line here, we have about 41% or so of residents that have below average accessibility, and in the case of Mexico City, that's as much as 64%. And we use this cutoff of average accessibility as the way that we define the underserved in each of these cities. And so we essentially are saying that with this data, about 2/3 of people in Mexico City are underserved in terms of access to job opportunities, and slightly lower percentages in Johannesburg. And as I said before, mode use is quite an important driver of these differences, as one would expect as well. Johannesburg's mode use graph is more intuitive, where you can see that the people with the highest accessibility are car users, and that matches also what spatial patterns in the city look like that I will show you in a short while. So we plotted accessibility against mobility, and the mobility we calculated by looking at the maximum of the travel time and the travel cost that people spend traveling to their current job. We got these from OD surveys in each city, and each of those are normalized against the average. So if you spent twice the average travel time to get to your work, then that would be your mobility score, would be 100% above the average. We again did this for work, by mode, and we added also in here non-travelers, because from OD surveys we can tell who the people are who are actually not traveling at all on the given survey day. And plotting accessibility and mobility against each other gives us this 4-quadrant kind of plot. The kind of 4-quadrant thinking seems to be popular in these WRR papers. But for our purposes, this defines 4 different groups that helps us to pull apart the idea of what access people have and what do they do with that access on the mobility side. So our contribution to the lexicon here are these 4 groups of users. Right at the bottom right here, people with high accessibility and low mobility expenditures are what we would call well-located urbanites. So people who probably live in well-located kind of central areas close to jobs, and they actually don't have to travel very long times or long travel costs to get to where they want to go. So in our scheme, this is the most advantaged, the bottom right is the most advantaged quadrant to be in. Top right, what we call well-located commuters, people who have relatively high access, but also they do travel more than the average in terms of travel times and costs. So these are people who typically choose to have more than the absolutely necessary minimum amount of travel, partly because they are privileged and higher income people who are able to do that. So that includes a lot of car users. To the left side of the graph are people with below average accessibility. So they are the underserved in the way that we define them in this paper. Top left, the mobile underserved are people with low access but high mobility, so people who are typically located in peripheral areas and areas where they have to travel a long time, either by public transport or by car, to get to jobs. And the bottom left, the stranded underserved, typically people who are located in poor locations and do not travel. Sometimes people do not travel or don't travel much or long distances because they choose not to, but there's also certainly a transport contribution there where unaffordability and poor travel conditions and low coverage of public transport helps people to be stranded and to not travel around as much as they might want to. We plotted for the two different cities these 4 quadrants, and I'm just going to show you what are the results that we got for the two cities. This is in the case of Johannesburg. The different blobs show the different modes, and the size of the blob shows the number of people in each zone who fell into that category. So you can see that there's about 9% of residents here in the bottom right who fall into the well-located urbanites category. That includes some public transport users, but in the case of Joburg, no walkers and bikers, and no car users, at least at the level of aggregation that we are plotting here. So a relatively small proportion of the population. We don't have very high residential densities within the urban core, so this didn't surprise me very much. If you look at the top right, well-located commuters, they're generally more well-off people located in old suburbs, closer to the kind of the historically affluent suburbs closer to the CBD. Mostly car users, also some public transport users there in the corner. So these are the kinds of folks who, especially if they're car users, tend to travel quite a lot, and the kinds of issues that we associate with overuse of the car in terms of externalities and in terms of adding to congestion and bringing down public transport speeds, these kinds of issues really fall within the user groups in the upper right quadrant. Upper left quadrant, the mobile underserved, is in the case of Joburg about 25% of residents, and mostly public transport users there. And that refers to then people who are living in peripheral townships, 30, 40 kilometers away sometimes from job opportunities and from the central city, who are using public transport for quite long trips. One additional issue that contributes to these kind of long trips that people make is the level of fragmentation and unintegration that we find in public transport. Not much integration between the formal and informal services, and people often having to change buses or change from a minibus to a formal train or bus and having to pay an extra fare, and that pushes up their mobility costs there. And that's a picture that we find in many cities in the global south, issues of non-integration really contributing to high mobility costs. And then bottom left, the stranded underserved, which includes, in our case, almost all people who walk to work, and some public transport users, and some stranded people who actually don't travel very much or don't travel very long distances. So the stranded underserved would be people who are facing expensive commutes. They can't afford it. They don't actually travel as much. And there are other reasons in the transport sphere that also contribute to being stranded. Some of them include security issues. There are a lot of women who fall into that category who simply don't feel safe enough to travel or to travel as much as they would like to. We plotted this spatially just to sort of check whether it made sense, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, but it made sense in terms of the locations of where these different quadrants are. So in the case of Joburg, you can see the green areas, which are the high access, low expense, the bottom right quadrant, well-located urbanites clustered around the Joburg CBD and in some other areas which are closer to job opportunities as well. People can walk and bike to those opportunities if they want to. The blue areas are sort of the next ring, the high access, high expense, the commuters who travel those long distances typically by car, and those are all high income car using affluent kind of areas in our sample. And then the yellow and the red are the underserved in the way that we've defined them, tend to be out on the peripheries where access is low and mobility costs are either high or mobility is restrained. A similar picture in Mexico City. Maybe I should come back to the Mexico City one. once we've looked at the graph there. This is now, again, the preliminary results for Mexico City. As I said, the accessibility, where these blobs are on the accessibility scale might still change a bit. What we see in Mexico City is that we have the mobility cost of car users, as one would expect, same as in Joburg, the highest. Car users tend to spend more time and especially more money on their travel. And then we have public transport sort of here in the middle band, about 43% of residents falling into the mobile underserved group. That includes both car users and public transport users. And quite a lot, a big concentration of people in the stranded underserved group here on the bottom left as well, about 27%, which includes a lot of people walking from poor locations with low accessibility to places where they can find work. And getting back to the map, the green areas with low mobility expenses are again clustered around the CBD area, and then as one moves away from the CBD into the areas to the bottom, to the south, and also the areas to the north, you move to lower access and higher mobility expenditure kinds of locations. Okay, so this gives us a bit of an insight as to not only how accessibility is distributed in these cities, but also how that affects the way that people can travel around and the way that the kind of problems that people face. And this leads us to the next point, which is, so what can we do about it? What should we do about it? And depending on in which quadrant we find people being located, one can identify different strategies that would tend to improve the situation. So firstly, if you're looking at people in the stranded, underserved quadrant, bottom left, those are clearly people who would benefit from both improvements to their accessibility to move them to the right, but also people who can benefit from improved mobility. So that would tend to move them upwards. And there's a whole list of strategies that might come into play to improve access. Some of them might be location kind of policies to get services, schools, jobs, and so on closer to those communities. So land use kinds of interventions. For the stranded, underserved, if affordability is a big constraint, then better non-motorized transport, walking and biking facilities that can make it more easy for people to get around without having to pay public transport fares might be a very effective strategy to improve their accessibility. At the top left, for the mobile underserved, clearly an issue is the high mobility costs that people have. So one can imagine that reducing the mobility costs of those communities, both car users and public transport users, would be one way of serving them better. But also they are underserved in terms of accessibility, so we want to move to the right-hand side as well. So this red arrow kind of shows a movement towards the bottom right, where we would improve their access, and that might include, again, land use strategies, transit-oriented development, densification in the right kind of places, those kinds of strategies to improve access and reduce trip distances, which will then also affect their mobility costs. At the top right, we have well-located commuters, people who are not underserved in the sense that we've defined it in terms of accessibility, but still people who have high mobility costs, and those high mobility lifestyles contribute to some of the problems of the city as a whole and of the underserved portions of the population. So excess car use contributing to congestion, slowing down public transport, making it less likely that people can walk and bike around. So those kinds of things does affect sort of the whole picture. And therefore, the general movement downwards to reducing the mobility costs of that inefficient private vehicle use seems to be the right kind of approach to follow. So sort of in general, a movement towards the bottom right is the kind of approach that we've taken in identifying the strategies that will serve these different groups in this paper. We also then identified a contributing factor which underlies all of this, and that has to do with land use and urban growth policies. So many of the problems that we see in terms of excessive travel costs and low accessibility are exacerbated by urban growth policies, and also by the kind of decisions that are being made at metropolitan and sometimes national level around investment priorities. So there's clear evidence of prioritization towards the car in investment and also in some of the actions that are being taken. That graph there shows just the public subsidy money. This is estimated by ITDP in India, the kind of public subsidies per trip that are allocated across the different modes in Tamil Nadu. And you can see that the car, of course, gets a lot more subsidy per trip than the other modes, and public transport is worse off. Walking and biking is not even on the graph there. Then we have issues with urban expansion and the fact that we have cities growing at the peripheries, which tend to expand travel distances, and that happens in both formal suburban kind of development, edge development, as well as informal development. In some cases, especially in African cities, we have an over-densification and over-concentration in central cities, and central cities becoming so congested and there not being enough of forward planning to selectively decentralize and provide for economic development that's closer to some of the newer residential areas. And then lastly, cities generally suffer from a lack of control over their expansion. And this is something that Anjali, I think, has addressed quite a lot in her urban expansion paper that's forthcoming, which makes it increasingly difficult to serve these cities with transport that is both affordable and of a sufficient quality that people would want to migrate to other modes if they are already off of them. Okay, so some key thoughts that underlied our selection of the priority actions. The first one, that cities will be in different quadrants and different stages of their development. So the city would have to sort of see where the major issues are and which parts of the city fall into these different quadrants to figure out what the local strategy should be, and when and where and at what pace and in what order the strategies would be implemented. Of course, a lot of these actions are mutually reinforcing, so not a single action is enough on its own. And we strongly take the view that one needs a systemic approach where there's some local action that needs to happen on the ground, better street design, better design related to individual developments, local schemes for bike share and street crossings and whatnot, but also at the more systemic, at the high level, things that need to change within planning, governance, and finance. And we talk about those enablers later on as well. But there's definitely, I think the fact that we have cities that are growing so fast, and the fact that we have that we are going to have to invest in housing and in infrastructure at very high rates in many cities that are fast growing over the next few decades, provide opportunities for doing things right and for addressing these problems at both levels. Okay, so this is an outline of the paper. I've kind of dealt with the first blob there, which is the introduction around equitable access, and what do we mean by the underserved, and what's the vision that we are seeing in terms of moving to the bottom right quadrant of that figure, and then urban growth policies. Then we launched the biggest part of the paper. It talks about confronting the challenge of accessible cities, so the action areas that we've identified. And we identified 3 main action areas that we expand on quite a lot in the paper. The first one is to build complete, balanced, and safe streets. The second action area is to revamp multimodal public transport networks. And the third one is to manage the demand for private vehicle use. And then lastly, we zoom in on the different enablers. These are cross-cutting issues that need to be addressed across these different action areas, which include capable visionary governments, integrated public sector planning, and innovative partnerships for funding. So I will I will talk about each of these briefly as we go on. So the first priority action area, to build complete, balanced and safe streets. I think this is sort of generally accepted in this audience. Streets are the basic building block of communities, and walking is the dominant mode in most cities of the global south. This is just some statistics that shows for sort of a range of different cities what the different mode shares are, and you can see the green band, the walk and bicycle mode share ranging from about 25-30% in some cities up to 50%, and some African cities that are not on this list, 90% of trips being made on a daily basis on foot. So clearly a mode that's extremely important. At the same time, conditions are often deteriorating for people who are on foot and people who are biking because of increases in motorization. And some other places, things are picking up again and swinging around. Latin America and Asia, conditions are improving again after some slump for people on foot and by bike. So we identified two specific problems to warrant action. The first one is that we have incomplete street networks, especially in informal areas. So new areas that are jumping up because of fast in-migration and urbanization. The cities typically cannot keep track with providing good street infrastructure and access to those areas. The second thing is around design and technical aspects of providing sufficient streets, which are typically biased away from pedestrians and bike users. And then also the fact that capacity is tend to be allocated towards cars rather than public transport and non-motorized transport users. So that leads to the three main action areas that we listed. The first one is to complete street networks in places where they are not complete yet. The second action area, to reallocate road space towards more space-efficient modes. And the third one is to improve pedestrian safety and security. So I will expand on each of these a little bit. So the complete street networks, we're talking about all-weather paved roads, especially in informal settlements. In many cases, arterials leading to the residential areas are either not provided, or when they are provided, they are really unbalanced in terms of what they make provision for. So introduction of and promotion of complete street principles, clearly important for making sure that road upgrades really provide for all users. And I think there shouldn't be any reason why all new arterials that are being built or upgraded should not follow complete street principles, at least best practice principles, to provide for at least sidewalks and safe crossings, because these arterials are really used not just by cars, but very often by people walking very long distances along them to get to opportunities. They are pretty bad conditions sometimes. So to reallocate road space towards more space-efficient modes, that includes then non-motorized transport aspects of arterials and road upgrades, upgraded roads. But secondly, also to somehow effect reallocation of capacity away from car modes, especially towards public transport, and that could be lanes, bus lanes. It could be part of bus rapid transit kinds of systems where that makes sense if the volume is there. It could also be lower levels of priority, such as intersection treatments, priority for paratransit vehicles at intersections, to give them a queue bypass, for instance. That could help to decrease those mobility costs for public transport users. And then thirdly, also to design and to protect the access function of arterials. Arterials are often designed as if they are just mobility spines, yet there are lots of land uses that jump up next to them because they are signals well, they attract new development along these arterials, and that creates a big conflict between sort of what the city assumes would be fast-moving vehicles along these arterials and people who actually have to access the arterials from the land users. So there are some design principles that can help with designing better for the access function of these arterials. And then lastly, to improve pedestrian safety and security, there's very good work that's been done in the road safety sector, some of it here at the WRI, to identify effective strategies for this. So, on high-speed roads or higher speed roads, such as arterials and so on, we need sidewalks wide and well-lit and well-drained, bike lanes where that makes sense. We need to look at the overall street design and street context, safe road crossings, medians, barriers, connections to land users next to it, and then and there are sort of good examples that we mentioned in the paper that I don't have time to go into here. And then in roads and road elements where we have shared use between pedestrians or vulnerable users and car users, there's very good evidence that reducing traffic speeds to about 35 kilometers per hour or lower helps a lot with reducing accidents and severity of accidents. And there are various traffic calming kind of techniques that help a lot with achieving that. So this is again stuff that's that we know how to do. There's lots of guidelines out there to do it. The thing that's needed to push this is a policy framework in many cases, and in many cases communities that are advocating and asking and demanding for better design of the roads in their area. And I think when we talk about enablers, we'll come back to some of these things. So you say in the paper that we strongly argue for a rethink of the role of streets to find a more optimal balance between the interests of motorists, public transport, and non-motorized users. Okay, the second priority action area is to talk about multimodal public transport networks. So public transport is certainly key to the mobility of the underserved, especially people at the top half of that graph. But they're also a powerful tool to restructure cities. And given that cities often have less ability to guide urban development and to guide expansion and to control the rate at which the cities are expanding, one of the things that many cities can do is to invest in infrastructure. And if that can be guided to invest efficiently in infrastructure that supports good public transport, that is one way to help gain better, sort of guide the future of mobility in the cities more effectively. We also understand that there's quite a complex ecosystem of formal and informal public transport modes. Informal being the paratransit, smaller vehicles and 2- and 3-wheelers that are used in many cities. And there's a whole set of private modes that are coming up that are becoming part of the ecosystem, car sharing and ride matching, ride hailing kinds of services that are coming up. So how do we make our way through this changing landscape of different services that are being provided? So some of the problems that we briefly discuss include a poor and a declining supply of formal public transport in many cities. Many African cities don't have any formal public transport left. Also, the quality of public transport is declining in some places. In places where paratransit has taken over, the paratransit has provided for essentially being the protector of mobility in many of these cities and of access because they continue to provide services, but at lower quality levels, and that also has its own costs. So paratransit, we in this paper strongly suggest that the informal modes are not just a problem, or not a problem per se, but they're actually an opportunity to move towards a more integrated system that includes both formal and informal elements. However, from our reading of the literature and looking at the kind of experiences that we have up to now, there's no single good model of how to deal with informality in public transport. And it's not exactly clear how to move towards them, how to move towards a more effective integration and modernization of the paratransit industry. So there's some ideas that we'll talk about just now. And then lastly, there's one of the main issues that's often not noticed is the fact that there's very poor integration across these different modes and these different systems, where just by integrating systems better, one can certainly get a lot more out of the existing networks by making sure that people can move from one mode or one vehicle to another, including non-motorized, in a more efficient and a lower cost way. Okay, so the list of actions then firstly addresses the issue of integration, so to connect the existing services into an integrated network. So that's just to leverage what we already have, to invest in priority infrastructure, to proactively upgrade and integrate informal operators, to look at technology and to see how that can improve productivity and the user experience, and lastly, targeted subsidies where that is affordable and makes sense. Okay, so firstly, talking about the integration, action A there. Well, the first thing that's needed is sort of a mindset change at city government level to say that the city is responsible for the entire multimodal public transport network, actually entire transport network, public transport as well as non-motorized. And that understanding is actually not necessarily present in a lot of city governments. So to think that they can do something towards integrating and guiding the whole system towards a more rational and a more better user-oriented kind of network. Cities can invest in transfer infrastructure to make it easier for people to transfer, changes to formal and informal bus routes and schedules and pick-up and drop-off points and so on can help a lot to make systems integrate better, provide provision of information, and there's lots of sort of technological alternatives that are coming up now to provide better information to users through phones and through other media forms. And then lastly, fair integration is a very effective way of promoting integration within the public transport sphere. If a way can be found to prevent people having to pay twice for when moving from one mode or one vehicle to another. Okay, investing in priority infrastructure. So we advocate game-changing investments in dedicated infrastructure. That could be simple bus lanes. It could be larger systems, bus rapid transit kinds of systems. That's a whole package of different interventions. It could be rail in cases where that makes sense. Clearly, the decision as to what level of dedicated infrastructure is one that has to be taken at city level, depending on the level of demand that's available, the congestion levels, the land that's available, and the financial resources of the city. But in order to reduce those mobility costs, and to make the point about reallocating road space away from the minority of car users towards all users, there should be there are big opportunities for improving the provision of dedicated priority infrastructure for other modes, and huge benefits from that. So we have some good examples, for instance, where one lane on a freeway, for instance, in Cape Town in South Africa, by changing it from a general traffic lane into a dedicated lane, you can increase the capacity of, we have increased the capacity of people using that lane tenfold, and by doing nothing more than some striping and some enforcement. Right, so what to do about informal operators? So there's been a variety of different approaches towards paratransit reform. I can't go through this in too much detail, but a whole range of different approaches, from very forceful kinds of interventions to force informal operators to formalize and to become formal concessioned operators as part of BRT systems, towards a range of more accommodating kinds of interventions, down to a simple training and professionalization of the industry. And there's a whole bunch of cases that one can look at to find examples of what worked and what didn't. So there's no single answer at this point. So there's a suggestion that when the opportunity arises to formalize informal operators by linking it to catalytic projects like to BRT implementations or light rail, to get them into the formal sector, that often does provide very big benefits, but it's often very risky and it might take quite a bit of time. So there's certainly scope also for a more incremental kind of approach, a more incremental upgrading through better regulation, introducing of various concession and contracting kinds of schemes, better investment in the paratransit industry and investment in dedicated infrastructure for them, and use of technology to get the informal operators on a more efficient operating level and so forth. That can help. Yeah, this is one example. You might be familiar with the digital Matatu project in Nairobi in Kenya, where just mapping the Matatu routes out for the first time provided a huge step forward in terms of passenger information. There's also information for the city to be able to plan and visualize and actually see for the first time what they have, rather than to try to ignore it and to sort of suppress it. In Durban, there's an example, for instance, of the city partnering with the minibus taxi operators to contract with them to upgrade their services without asking them to formalize and give away their vehicles and everything, but just to provide for better monitoring and better service quality, for which they receive a small payment to be part of that system. Okay, so a whole range of different approaches that can be done. I think the main point that we make is that cities should start by recognizing informal operators in policy, making them more visible in the city's approaches, and to start talking to them about how things can, firstly, what's wrong and how things can be improved. Okay, harnessing technology. So there's a whole raft of new technologies coming online that one needs to be sort of aware of, and a lot of them, for a lot of them, it's not clear yet where they're going to go and what the end result will be. Some of them will for instance, provide already great examples of giving passengers access to more services through, smartphone-based trip planning apps and so forth. The whole area of e-hailing and ride matching is expanding very fast, and those provide certainly big opportunities for, especially for first, last mile kind of trips, to get people that don't have very good public transport access in their areas, get them onto public transport. So this could serve some of the well-located commuters as well as the underserved commuters, and also provide better ridership for the bus and paratransit industries. I think what we say in the paper is that cities need to be more agile and more proactive in trying to partner with the various providers of this technology to see how they can incorporate that into their plans, and to try to make the whole thing work together better as a system. The last point under the multimodal public transport networks action area has to do with targeted subsidies. So generally, financial sustainability of good public transport is a major issue. It's definitely an issue in African cities and in many other cities in the world as well. Even some of the ones that have seemed to make a lot of progress in Latin America, it remains an issue. How are we going to pay for the next set of expansions? So generally considered to be optimal to set fares at cost recovery levels, if that's possible, at least recovering the operating costs. That's to promote financial sustainability. But there's definitely a need to protect the affordability of the underserved and of lower income commuters, and that's where targeted subsidies can come in. And there are some great examples from Latin America now where smart card-based systems that are linked to some sort of welfare database can be used to target user-side subsidies specifically to people that we want to have lower levels of fare payments because they can afford less. So where does that money come from? So where does the money come from for these kinds of operational subsidies? Well, that is where one of the enablers comes in and saying that there are opportunities for gaining, capturing more of the benefits of public transport and good transport investment back into the transport purse, if you want, to help us improve the affordability of these services. So the quote here, well-targeted public transport can be a very progressive tool in the investment toolbox, and in the longer run, good transit is essential for restructuring cities to become more spatially equitable. Okay, so the third priority action area is to manage the demand for private vehicle use. So we note that car and should be three-wheeler use grows in many cities, even though the cities are investing in public transport. There's private vehicles do provide utility, door-to-door kind of travel that public transport doesn't. But there's also strong political support for car-based kind of development patterns, which tends to lock in this kind of development, even for people who don't want to use cars and two-wheelers. So the problem is underpinned by an economic reason, the underpricing, stuff that you probably all know about, in terms of hidden externality costs and also the hidden fixed costs of car ownership or motorcycle ownership. That gets worse in denser conditions. And then car-oriented land use development patterns are really the thing that locks it in. So the actions that we promote here, firstly, to change the preferential status of the car in quite visible ways, to price car use and especially parking, to promote shared mobility solutions, mostly through technological approaches, and to ensure that new development is either transit-oriented or can be well served by transit. To reallocate, to change the preferential status of the car, how do we do that? Well, firstly, again, very visibly reallocating road space capacity away from cars towards other more efficient modes. There's also some good examples of car restriction policies in various places that have been tried. A lot of new such schemes in China now. The evidence is somewhat mixed around the long-term benefits of these car restriction policies, but it might be part of the short-term approach. Pricing, congestion charging, by sort of the evidence that we have, seems to be less likely in the global south because of political resistance. We suggest that parking reform, including charging for parking, charging for all parking, reducing parking provision, enforcement, and so on, can be a much more effective way of starting to change the inefficient pricing structure of car use. Shared mobility solutions can include car sharing, bike sharing, ride sharing kind of apps, the kind of bus aggregators that we get in India, especially if these can be linked to transit then to get people to and from fixed route transit. And then lastly, we spend a bit of time on transit-oriented development, which is really pedestrian-oriented development because it's talking about places that are attractive for people once they get on or once they get off of public transport or when they're in that development area on foot. And an important aspect of that is to protect affordable housing within these areas because the land values tend to go up quite a lot and it's very easy to drive out affordability, drive out lower income households and actually make it worse in terms of equity. So social housing and low cost housing, important part of this mix. So we do not argue that cities should attempt to get rid of cars and motorcycles, but it's clear that society is worse off as a result of excessive private vehicle use. So sort of the key word being that excessive. And cities cannot make this sustainable headway towards equitable accessibility unless the demand for private vehicle use is managed. Just very briefly, what we try to do throughout the paper is to illustrate that while the three action areas are in the first instance aimed at promoting equity for those sort of underserved groups that we talked about, there's a lot of evidence that the kind of things that we talk about here are firmly within the sustainable transport paradigm that have been around for a decade or two, and there's a lot of evidence that they also promote economic productivity, they also promote environmental quality, so it goes towards the larger vision of this World Resource Report. This is my last slide around enabling conditions and actors. The first one we identified as capable and visionary governance, which includes leaders that should be able to form and articulate a new vision, and that should be underpinned by institutional strengthening. There's a lot of need for capacity building and renewal of institutions, and in many cases a very dedicated and sort of focused multimodal transport authority seems to have achieved a lot of benefits in some cities. Integrated public sector planning that talks about creating ways to coordinate across housing and urban expansion and transport, create ways of gaining better control over land use development and urban management kinds of things, and to create more inclusive planning processes that can include the underserved in the technical planning process as well. And then innovative partnerships for funding. In order to improve the financial viability of public transport services, it's important for public transport to be serving both middle class and lower income users, so that there's an opportunity for cross-subsidization to happen between the two different types of users. And there's some suggestions about how to do that, both spatially and in terms of service design. Then we talked about sharing the benefits of public transport investment, for instance, through land value capture, co-development with the private sector. So there's a lot of sort of good learning that's happening around that. That's important. And then lastly, to also partner with technology providers to provide for kind of some of the synergies between the public sector and the private around the technology. Okay, so in conclusion, the challenges are large and complex, and no single pathway exists, but there's sufficient evidence that by moving towards a future where access to opportunities is enhanced for all city residents, cities will also be making headway towards economic growth, environmental sustainability, and social health.